So come in and join us on TheDustyFeet.com because this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God, interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings they may be challenged, divine misunderstandings they may exist, and traditional teachings they might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So feel free to journey around the space. We have so many different topics for discussion. We have Outside the Class, Sons of the Father, Bible Project, Aleph Beta, Follow the Red String, and more. Lend your ear and then lend your voice. Join a conversation. Start a conversation. Ask questions. Because on this journey, you're probably around folks that just might be pondering the same thing. Community that can build and connect. Come in and join us. Good evening and welcome to the Dusty Feet. It's March 30th, 2023, and we're continuing our series about how to view the Bible. This is part 6 because we'll be discussing biblical narrative, characters. And of course, we're using the videos from the Bible Project as our launch point, right? So we'll continue from there and let's see where it takes us. In the description below are links to all of the audio, video, and source documents that we use here in the Dusty Feet. We want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, the learning we do here does not happen. And remember on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe and click that bell icon if you want. Like we've mentioned each week, and we'll start. We're going to start by addressing these expectations, right? One, this is not a definitive "you shall do this," but it is just hopefully a way one might opt to look at things. Okay. Number two, this is a series, so there will be no one-line answers. Actually, there'll be many episodes with different responses and different options. Three, give grace as each person learns more about this wonderful collection of scrolls that we call the Bible. And four, again, this is a series that builds on itself. So there is an expectation that one would have at least listened to the previous episodes to keep things in context, because we are building here. And five, through this series, I will probably have a few points where I have a differing opinion from Tim and John. But by no means am I saying that they are wrong. I just have a differing view on some things. I have nothing but the highest honor and respect for these two and all the work that they do and their team at the Bible Project. Okay. I also want to continue to remind you all of the podcast from Rabbi David Foreman and the folks at Aleph Beta, right? A book like no other. Because he too is continuing to remind his audience that these are important elements to really grasp in Torah as well. Not really surprised at all. But for those that are interested in this podcast, the link is in the description below. So, let's continue the journey with the next video, Biblical Narrative Character. Enjoy.
We're talking about how to read biblical narrative, or in other words, how to read stories.
Right. And one of the main ingredients of any good story is characters who encounter conflict and then have to overcome it.
Yeah, let's talk about characters. In most stories, we quickly identify with characters because, just like them, we're in our own story having our own conflicts that we need to overcome.
Yeah, and good stories have characters with relatable struggles. We can watch them react to these challenges in different ways, and we get to see what happens as a result. Through characters, an author can show us their view of what it means to be human. The Bible's no different. Biblical stories use characters as a mirror so we can see ourselves and discover our own human nature in the reflection.
The thing about characters in the Bible is that they can be hard to relate to. I mean, often there's very little detail given about them.
Yeah, biblical authors develop characters differently than modern narratives. They prefer to communicate a lot through minimal detail. For example, we rarely hear what people look like in the Bible, but when we do, it's crucially important for the story.
Like we're told that Saul is tall and David was kind of a runt.
And these become images of their moral character. Saul's height matches his love of status and power to impose authority, while David humbly accepts his low status and allows God to exalt and deliver him.
So people's physical appearances are symbolic.
Yeah, very often. Like Esau's hairy body fits his animal-like behavior, and Jacob's smooth skin matches his deceptive, slippery nature.
What other clues do we get about biblical characters?
Well, often people's names symbolize their role in the story. Abraham in Hebrew sounds like father of a multitude. Jacob means deceiver. Ruth means refreshment. And Saul, his name means the one asked for. He's the flawed king that the people requested.
So by packing all this meaning with very little detail, biblical stories can do a lot in a little space.
And they even leave out things that modern readers want to know about these characters. Like they rarely come out and tell us people's thoughts or motives.
Right, like when Moses saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite, he kills him on the spot. But why? Was this righteous anger, or did he just lose his cool? And was it okay with God that he did it?
Yeah, we're not told. Because biblical authors usually avoid giving moral commentary. They would rather have a character's words and actions reveal their motives and then leave us to judge their behavior by seeing the consequences. So in the case of Moses, this murder's the beginning of a pattern of his anger getting the best of him with bad results. This choice forces him to run and hide in the desert for 40 years.
So it was a bad thing. But he does meet his wife out there, so it's a good thing?
Exactly. It forces you to ponder. Through all these techniques, the biblical narrators keep their stories compact, memorable, but also engaging.
But seriously, was Moses being good or bad? Right? Like in classic stories, there's always a good guy and a bad guy, some admirable hero who faces off against some horrible villain.
Sure, and simplified characters like that are helpful for teaching children there's such a thing as good and evil. But the Bible's not a children's book. Its characters are very complex, a mixed bag of good and evil, just like us. There's hardly any flawless characters in the Bible.
What about heroes of the faith, like Abraham or King David?
So you mean Abraham, who used an Egyptian slave for sex and then lied about his wife 2 times to save his own neck? And David, the man after God's own heart, who sleeps with another man's wife and then murders him? These stories are anything but simplistic. They offer us realistic portraits of compromised people like ourselves. The real surprise is that God keeps working with them despite their failures.
So, just because a person's called by God or wins a battle, becomes successful or wealthy, it doesn't mean the biblical author wants me to act like them.
Right. It would actually be really dangerous to imitate most biblical characters.
True. But there must be something admirable in biblical characters, something I can imitate.
Absolutely. Pay attention, and you'll notice that most biblical stories highlight the moments when characters fail or come to the end of themselves, and then they choose radical trust in God's grace and wisdom. It's in these stories that the authors show us how to be a human who truly pleases God through humility and surrender.
Yeah, the fact that God stays committed to biblical characters is a profound statement about the patience and love of God, who is also a character.
Right. And by studying biblical characters, we can observe our own worst tendencies on display. And we see time and again God's gracious response that will see this story through to the end.
So, biblical narrative characters, right? So, how do you see biblical characters? Do you see them as folks to be read about, as in detached and unconnected? Or might you view them, and maybe at a stretch, I tend to lean this way, as a story about my own heritage? And what I mean by that is that these folks are part of my own religious heritage and my journey. Because these are the people that are directly responsible for me being the follower of God that I am today. Um, It's probably most often referred to, of course, as Jewish history, right? The story of the Jewish people. And I have to admit, it does show that. But yet, it really is so much more. It's a story about God's interaction with mankind, with a glimpse into the beginnings and the origins of the Jewish people. These Hebrews that are chosen to they're chosen by God as representatives of God to the nations. And of course, it drives us to Jesus, right? But now we heard Tim and John reference the character flaws of many of these people. Yes, it does bear those flaws for sure, yet they are also an honest look, actually, at people very much like us. I've said it before, and I'm going to say it again. I tend to lead towards the thought that the biblical narrative is not finished, that we are not at the end yet. So it might not be thought of as the them in the biblical stories, but maybe more about this is how we got here, right? And maybe then what are we passing on to those that follow us? So, what biblical narrative are we leaving others to see, especially if we are characters? Because I expect that our collective histories will often follow these stories, right? John brought up the point that often there's a very little detail about these characters in the Bible, right? Yet it seems that we have no problem filling in those details. It's funny. It's oddly enough that at times we've probably relied too much on the images that have been put before us, right? These pictures that we use to fill in the gaps. Uh, King David was ruddy, right? So here's the verse from First Samuel. So set up. Samuel is talking to Jesse, David's dad, and he's asking, "Is this all your sons?" And Jesse's response was, "No, I have another. It's David. I'll go get him from the field." And so 16:12 says, "So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And Yahweh said, 'Arise, anoint him, for this is he.'" Okay, so this is part of the fun biblical narrative, and of these characters, right? How do we view them in our mind's eye? So if you were the artist, how would you capture this very small, tidy description of David? Okay, so now I'm going to add another interesting thought to the discussion because it's also about character, as in how we act. We see in these biblical characters that Tim and John bring up that it's um, most often these physical descriptions, and yet we seem to get much more about the character description of these folks. Yeah, I find it interesting when I'm asking folks to describe people, and there's a mixed bag of responses, both physical and character. Personally, I haven't asked around enough to get a definitive feel for which is more prevalent, um, because there very much are both and sometimes a mix. So now for fun, let's add one more piece to the mix that we will probably never really get from the biblical narrative, except in some very rare occasions. And even then, we still have a lot to fill in. Like Moses was slow of speech. So it's about how did they sound? You know, have you ever, I'm even asking that's rhetorical, but have you ever heard the voice of someone and then you met them? And the comment that followed was, you don't look like your voice sounds, or you're not what I pictured when I heard your voice. So there really is so much to a person, so many details. I wonder how many folks would describe me or you to another person and which details would they share? Yeah. Um, most of that would probably be based on how long they would have known us. Yeah. And maybe even how close they are to us. So, n- okay, so now we have some of the examples that Tim and John brought up about the descriptions of these folks, right? But we get to these. We have Esau's hairy body and Jacob's smoother one. So, is that how we would expect a physical description of ourselves to also create the character image? Hmm. How many of us, and wait, I'm going to bring this up. How many of us honestly have specifically been named because of the meaning of our names that would be a later descriptor of ourselves in life, right? Because I have mixed thoughts on names in the Bible, right? As in that the actual meaning at the time that they were born and named, yeah, or did that meaning develop over many years due to the retelling of these stories and maybe the lessons derived from those stories? Example, as in did Rebecca and Isaac actually decide to name their second son with the meaning of deceiver? Yeah, see my point? But then, right, yet we have someone like Abraham, right? Remember, his given name is Abram or Avrim, and that means exalted or high father. Now, remember that he is Terah's firstborn son, so it's not really a stretch there. And we have God that gives it a bit of a tweak, right? He upgrades his name to Abraham or Abraham, meaning father of many. Well, at least we know God's intention for sure. Yet, is that really the story? You know, um, I make this statement in my Outside the Class series due to the context of the material. And here's what I say. I want to make it kind of clear as we begin that I'll be mentioning and discussing some points that would be very challenging for some. And again, I suspect that it will divide the room at times. But my intent is to share what I currently believe and understand about the kingdom of God concepts, both narrow and wide. So, my focus, of course, is on the narrow and wide. So, with Abraham, with the name change, was he the father of many? Narrow view? No. Two kids. His great grandson lives down the road is has 12. Yeah, so no. But wide view, he's the father as in his lineage would be the children of the nation of Israel and more. So only the whole story as it unfolds gives us the actual picture. There was the promise from God, and that the only part that he saw was the births of Ishmael and Isaac. these characters in Scripture and in our everyday lives. So they're a mix of seen and unseen, as in described and left unsaid. So maybe that's part of the reason that the stories are the way that they are, right? Uh, it's a rather obvious part that they need to limit the words because of script and such, right? But maybe it's also for us to put on the sandals of those fellow members in the biblical narrative to see ourselves in the space. Again, I can't agree with and endorse enough the exercise of seeing ourselves in all of the biblical characters. It really can be an eye opening experience and maybe even a bit more of a connection. How did Tim put it? Um, Realistic portraits of compromised people like ourselves. God keeps working with them despite their failures, and they chose radical trust in God's grace and wisdom, and that truly pleases God through humility and surrender. Hmm? Scary thought. We see how these characters in the Bible, these very real people whose lives are captured, and they're very unaware of that. Yet it is their stories that tell us of the character of God and his love for us. So here's the question: what will our contribution to the story be? Are we even aware that we're part of it? And of course, like Abraham, we'll never know, but we believe in the promise. So, our next part in the viewing of the biblical narrative will be the setting. What is in the foreground and the background, right? Of these stories with these biblical characters. So, that ought to be fun. Okay, point to ponder. To throw something out. This will be fun. I think you'll enjoy this a little bit as it hits me this way. And this is a picture of Pierluigi Collina, right? Arguably, to me, the best referee in soccer history. In this picture, this is worth 1,000 words, both seen and unseen. That's what a story. And thanks for being with us tonight on the Dusty Feet.